Now, 2 weeks ago today, Prigozhin, the hot dog seller who became the head of the Wagner mercenary group, was said to have died after being killed in a plane crash. To discuss this further, let's bring in Sam, who is a British academic at the professor, and is also a professor in Russian politics and director of the Russian Institute at the King's College London. Thank you so much for joining me here on the programme today. Before we get into it all, for viewers who don't know, can you explain briefly who Prigozhin was?
Well, explaining who Prigozhin was briefly is really the challenge, isn't it? Because he was a lot of different things. You mentioned he was a hot dog seller. He was often referred to as Putin's chef. He seemed to have gotten his start in the business world, or at least in the legitimate business world, right? By getting into the sort of the fast food business and then into the catering business. Of course, he actually seems to have gotten his start sort of in the criminal underworld in St. Petersburg at a time when Putin was deputy mayor. President Putin, president of Russia right now, obviously, when he got his start in politics, was responsible for handling relationships between the St. Petersburg city administration and the business community. But that seemed to have also, involved relationships with the underworld and with the criminal community, including the mafia community. So there's some indication that that's where his path and that of Prigozhin first intersected. But Prigozhin, over the last several years, really has emerged as a very interesting and in very ways very important political figure in Russia. He did a lot of things that were useful to Putin and to the Kremlin and the Russian government. Right, one of which that most people might be aware of, right, is through the activities of his private military company that goes by the name Wagner, which fought in Syria, in Libya, and various parts of Africa, and most recently and most prominently in Ukraine, but also has a bit of a media empire and a social media empire, and is famous as well for the so-called troll farm of social media influencers, hackers, and trolls outside of St. Petersburg that have played around in Russian politics, in European politics, and in American politics over the years.
I mean, Prigozhin was reportedly said to have died back in 2019 when there was a plane crash in, I think, the Democratic Republic of Congo. What are the chances that this is actually true again? Another plane crash, but in Russia this time?
Well, it does appear that this particular instance of his death seems to be confirmed. Of course, the reality is that all the evidence we have is evidence that would be coming from the Russian government. Right, they're the only ones in a position to conduct this investigation. We haven't seen a body, we haven't seen DNA evidence, and we're not entirely sure that we would believe it if we had. But in the past, when he's gone missing, he has resurfaced. He certainly hasn't resurfaced on this particular occasion. And everyone from the Russian government, through to those in Prigozhin's circles and in Wagner itself, right, do seem to be behaving as though he is well and truly dead.
Talk to me about Prigozhin's relationship with, of course, Vladimir Putin. How has it evolved over the years?
Well, again, as I said, it began as a relationship in which, Prigozhin really was looking for opportunities to be very, very useful to Putin, and of course to enrich himself in the process. So he built a machinery and an infrastructure of influence, first and foremost, really beginning with online influence, media influence, running campaigns, first for political interests in Russia linked to the Kremlin or friendly to the Kremlin, but then beginning to play around more broadly. So he was really critical in the intervention of the Russian sort of cyber forces, as it were, in the U.S. presidential election in 2016. He was critical he has been critical, or his organizations were critical in running these sorts of operations elsewhere in Europe, also in Africa, places ranging from Mali to Madagascar. And then, of course, the operations of the private military company Wagner, right, operating as a sort of an off-the-books fighting force. What this has allowed the Kremlin to do is to really have influence in places where it may not want to get its hands dirty directly, right? It gives them plausible deniability at some kind of arm's length distance from what's going on in the field. Right, Prigozhin was able to play by rules that others weren't able to play by, and as a result, it really has multiplied in a lot of ways the Kremlin's influence, both regionally and globally. And so, Prigozhin really was, I think, a critical ally to Putin over the years. That may have begun to change over the last several months. So what we saw as the war in Ukraine dragged on was a growing disagreement between Prigozhin and the defense minister, a man by the name of Sergei Shoigu, about how the war was being handled. And some of this really did come down to the war itself. I think Prigozhin felt that the defense ministry should be more aggressive and should, in fact, be better managed and less corrupt than it was. But also he was arguing for more of the money being spent on the war to come in his direction and the direction of the Wagner private military company, rather than being spent directly through the defense ministry. And on the 24th of June of this year, he launched essentially a mutiny. He took his troops and tanks and armored personnel carriers and turned them in the direction of Moscow, began driving up the highway, essentially occupied the southern city of Rostov, where Russia had its military command headquarters for the operations in Ukraine, took some high-ranking officers hostage, and said that he was demanding the dismissal or resignation or essentially the head on a silver platter, right, of Mr. Shoigu, the defense minister, and Mr. Gerasimov, General Gerasimov, the head of the general staff of the Russian military. He was very careful at the time to say that this was not an attack on Putin, right? But it is hard to see how you try to force the president of a country into dismissing his appointed commanders and his appointed defense ministry, and not have that be taken as a threat, in fact, an armed threat, right, to the power of the president himself. And that certainly seems to be the way in which Putin perceived this uprising.
I mean, you touched on it a lot there. Let's talk about the significance of his death. What does it mean for the war in Ukraine and Russia? I mean, once again, you did touch on it an awful lot there, explaining it in a really great detail there. But is there anything else to add there?
Well, in the short run, it probably doesn't mean too much for what we see on the battlefield. Even before the uprising in June, Wagner had more or less pulled back from active military operations. It was retooling and re-recruiting, right? But it does not seem to be having an immediate impact in terms of what's going on the front lines. Down the road, of course, it might. Wagner has played an important role in recruiting people to fight in Ukraine for Russia. It has been able to recruit in ways that the Russian military can't directly, or at least cannot at the moment directly. So Wagner was famous for recruiting from prisons and from prison camps. It recruited convicts with the promise that if you served a tour of duty in Ukraine and survived, that you would then be released from prison. That's not yet an authority that the Russian military has been able to use directly. It also pays better than the Russian military does. And so it's not clear how this might affect the ability of the Russian government to recruit fighters to the war in the future. It's also not really clear, what happens to this whole infrastructure that Prigozhin had built, right? So to the troll farms and the global online influence operations, as well as to the military and paramilitary activities of Wagner in Africa, again in places like the Central African Republic and Mali and others.
The Wagner mercenary group, why did its involvement in the Russian invasion of Ukraine make Prigozhin, such a wanted man so internationally?
Well, really, certainly everybody, right, who was involved with this invasion has one way or another found themselves onto a sanctions list in the West. Um, there are ongoing, of course, war crimes investigations, and Wagner has been very powerfully implicated in that. But Wagner and Prigozhin have had a little bit less protection, right, when it comes to those sorts of investigations because they are not public officials. It is harder to bring a global or an international prosecution, including a war crimes prosecution, against somebody who does enjoy some diplomatic protection as a result of being an official of a recognized government, somebody like the defense minister Shoigu. Although, of course, as we know, Putin himself is now wanted by the International Criminal Court, right? So Prigozhin had a little bit less protection. Mercenary activities, generally speaking, are illegal under international and indeed under national law. Right? They're not legal under Russian law itself, and certainly not under Ukrainian law. But Wagner is also wanted for war crimes in Syria, in Libya, in the Central African Republic, and more broadly. Right? So Prigozhin has been a wanted man and seen globally as a criminal for a number of years now.
I mean, I know we can't really speculate, I guess, as much on this now because, of course, Prigozhin has reportedly died. If he hadn't, and of course he was returning, what would we expected to have seen in the war in Ukraine? Because, of course, there was that attack that, for many, actually came quite out of nowhere. Of course, there was a slight build-up, but it was quite unexpected. What would we have likely seen?
If it turns out that Prigozhin is alive, right? What would we have? What would we expect to see? I think that would be seen as a real challenge to Putin, right? I think most people, of course, we don't know what happened. We're assuming, and I think most people in Russia, right, are assuming that he's dead. Most people in Russia are probably also assuming that Putin and the Kremlin had something to do with his death. That this wasn't simply, a mechanical problem on his airplane. And so people are, I think, likely to interpret that as revenge, right, and as punishment for having challenged Putin in this way. If it turns out then that Prigozhin survived that attempt at revenge and that attempt at punishment, then I think it will lead people, it may lead people, including some very powerful people in Russia, to question the degree to which Putin is really in control of what's happening in the country. And it might potentially embolden people who are not happy with the way that things are going, right, to mount further challenges. But that is, as you say, very speculative.
The Russian investigators, one final question. I mean, they say they have evidence to prove that he has died. Why would they not release it? I mean, you've touched on everything more or less that I've asked you so far, but why wouldn't they release something like that to an international scale to prove that actually he has in fact died?
Well, I think it's probably multiple aspects to the answer to that question. One of which is, of course, is that the Russian government right now is not in the business of caring what anybody outside of Russia thinks. Right? If they were concerned about international opinion, they wouldn't be fighting this war in Ukraine, and so they were not about to allow international investigators, including investigators from Brazil and from Embraer, the company that made Prigozhin's plane, right? They're not about to give them access to investigate what happened. So that may be part of it. It might just be posturing. Part of it also, I think, is wanting to maintain plausible deniability. I think it's likely that if you were able to access the body, or in fact the bodies of the people on the plane, that might give you some evidence as to exactly what happened in the final moments of their lives. And if that were to then provide evidence that, for example, there was an explosive on the plane, right, that they were injured before they hit the ground, for example, right? That that might clarify in people's minds, and in fact, the role that the Russian government played in this incident. And I think the Kremlin would like to maintain for its own population, right, that degree of plausible deniability in terms of what actually happened.
Okay, Sam, thank you so much for joining me here on the program. Really do appreciate you joining me today. You give me a great insight. And of course, if you want to find out more news, you can visit our website at www.goodmorningnews.co.uk.